The first tear fell before the vows had even settled into memory. They stood amidst the dying light of a garden that was too still, surrounded by rows of white chairs and untouched champagne that glittered like expensive ice. 6 hours after the ceremony, the man she had called her husband didn't offer a celebratory toast. He offered an ending. He had married her to satisfy a dying man's wish, a cold pact of blood and duty, but the woman he actually cherished was 3 months pregnant and waiting for him beyond the iron gates of the estate. Kim Seo walked into that garden a bride, bound by the chains of her grandfather's legacy. She stood there now, watching the lace on her shoulders tremble, realizing that the man across from her was choosing a different life before the wedding cake had even been cut. Stay with me until the final word of this journey. If you are watching from Seoul, from Atlanta, or from a quiet corner of the world where you've ever had to choose between duty and your own heart, tell me your story in the comments. Because what Seoa discovers as the sun sets on her wedding day is a truth that would shatter any other woman. But for her, it is the only thing that could ever set her free. Let us begin. The silence in the garden was heavy, a thick velvet that muffled the distant sounds of the city. Kim Seoa stared at the hem of her ivory gown, tracing the intricate hand-stitched patterns that had taken months to complete. The dress felt like armor she no longer needed. Her hair was perfectly coiled, held in place by a diamond pin that felt like a leaden weight against her scalp. She was 27 years old. She had been a wife for exactly 6 hours and 14 minutes. Seo, we can still end this now. Samuel Youngmin's voice was steady, but it held the resonance of a tolling bell. He stood a few feet away, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up as if he were preparing for a battle rather than a honeymoon. He didn't look at her. He looked toward the horizon, where the sky was bruising into deep shades of violet and gold. She told herself he was merely overwhelmed by the weight of the Youngmin name. She told herself many things as they walked away from the cheering guests. The air has turned quite chilly, she said softly, her voice barely a ripple in the stillness. I will have the heaters brought out, he replied, though he made no move to leave. Seo lifted the heavy train of her dress with one hand, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked past him, her silk heels sinking slightly into the manicured grass. Through the tall glass windows of the estate she could see the remnants of the feast. A 3-tiered cake, which had cost more than some people earned in a year, sat lonely on its silver pedestal. The musicians she had spent weeks auditioning had packed away their instruments. Samuel finally turned. The light caught the sharp angle of his jaw, and for a moment, the guilt in his eyes was so bright it was blinding. I can't lie to myself anymore, he said, the words falling between them like stones into a deep well. I love someone else. She is radiant. She is bold. And Seo, she is carrying my child. Seo stood perfectly still. The confession was meant to be a blade, but as it landed she felt a strange, quiet warmth spreading through her chest. She inhaled slowly, the scent of crushed jasmine filling her lungs. Her tears were steady, flowing down her cheeks in silent tracks, but they were not tears of ruin. I know, she whispered. Samuel blinked, his composure fracturing. You know. We both knew this marriage was never ours, she continued, her voice gaining a beautiful melodic strength. We were merely honoring the ghosts of the people who demanded it of us. You have your chains, Samuel. And I have had mine. For a long minute, the only sound was the wind stirring the leaves of the ancient oaks. Samuel took a step toward her, his hand hovering near her shoulder, caught in the space between a husband's comfort and a stranger's apology. Let us divorce, she said. The celebration had become a museum of things that no longer mattered. Within the grand ballroom of the Kim estate, the air was thick with the scent of 2,000 white lilies, a fragrance that should have signaled a beginning but now smelled only of an ending. The crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, uncaring light over a sea of ivory silk and polished silver, illuminating a world that had frozen in the space of a single heartbeat. Rows of untouched champagne flutes stood upon the tables, the golden bubbles dying slowly in the glass, a quiet testament to a joy that had been surrendered before it could be tasted. Seo walked through the quiet hall, the heavy train of her wedding dress whispering against the marble floor like a secret. Every step felt as though she were moving through deep water. She stopped before the main banquet table, where the 3-tiered cake remained perfectly intact, its delicate sugar flowers a masterpiece of wasted effort. To the world outside those glass doors she was a bride at the summit of her life. To the man standing in the shadows of the balcony, she was merely a duty he had finally found the courage to put down. The awkwardness of the room was a physical weight. The guests had drifted away to the gardens or the parlors, their laughter replaced by the cautious, muted tones of people who knew the air had changed but did not know why. Seo reached out, her fingers grazing the cool surface of a silver tray. She realized then that the empire she was meant to protect was not made of stone or gold, but of these fragile, silent moments. She had spent her entire life preparing for this day, training her heart to beat in rhythm with her family's demands, only to find that the throne she had inherited was empty. Samuel appeared in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. He did not speak. The distance between them across the ballroom felt like a vast, unbridgeable canyon. He looked at the untouched feast, the expensive wine, and the floral arrangements that had cost a fortune, and for the first time, the majesty of it seemed to exhaust him. They were surrounded by the finest things wealth could provide, yet they were the two poorest souls in the building, bound by a contract that neither of their hearts had signed. Seo turned to face him, her expression composed, a mask of grace that she had worn since childhood. The diamond at her throat caught the light, shining with a cold, beautiful intensity. In this room, amidst the ruins of a celebration that never truly began, she understood that the weight of the untouched champagne was not a burden. It was an invitation. The silence was no longer a cage. It was the quiet before the dawn of a life she could finally call her own. The memory of them was a sun-drenched hallway where time felt like an endless afternoon. Long before the weight of ivory silk and the cold finality of divorce papers, there was a season where their names belonged only to themselves and not to the hungry empires that would eventually claim them. In those quiet corridors of youth, love was not a strategic alliance or a shield against a war. It was a shared note passed under a desk, a soft glance held across a crowded library, and a promise made in the hushed tones of those who believe the world is theirs to shape. They had been everything the future eventually stole, unburdened, certain, and beautifully unaware that the very blood in their veins was already drawing a map they would be forced to follow. Seo remembered the way the light used to filter through the cherry blossoms outside their classroom, casting moving shadows across Samuel's face as he leaned over his books. Back then, his hands were not meant for signing away the lives of thousands. They were hands that held her books and brushed away the stray hairs that the spring wind had tangled. Their conversations were a beautiful tapestry of ordinary dreams. Where they might travel, the books they would read, and the quiet life they imagined beyond the reach of their parents' tall gates. There was a softness to him then, a gentleness in the way he spoke her name that made the looming shadow of their families feel like a distant, harmless storm. They had walked the perimeter of the school grounds like two souls who had found a secret language. In the world of high stakes and ironclad expectations, their connection was a small, glowing candle in a vast darkness. Samuel would look at her with a clarity that saw past the Kim heiress, to the girl who loved old poetry and the smell of rain on hot pavement. He was simply a boy with an easy laugh, and she was a girl whose heart beat with a steady, unhurried rhythm. They were the architects of a small universe where duty was a word used by old men in mahogany offices, a concept that had no place in the warmth of a shared umbrella. But the hallways eventually narrowed. The laughter began to echo with the hollow sound of coming responsibility. Seo watched as the boy who had once written her poetry began to wear the heavy suits of a successor, his eyes losing their light as the Youngmin name began to demand its pound of flesh. They did not notice the moment the soft paths of their youth were paved over by the cold stone of legacy. They only knew that when they reached the end of those schoolyard days, they were no longer two children in love. They were two pieces on a board, waiting for the first move that would decide their fate. The room smelled of old paper and the sterile, clinical scent of a life coming to its final, quiet rest. In the heart of the Kim estate, far from the vibrant hallways of her youth, Seoa's grandfather lay amidst a sea of white linens, a man whose very name was a monument to the history of a city. He was a mountain in winter, fading into the mist, yet even as his breath grew thin, the gravity of his presence pulled the entire world toward his bedside. Outside the window, the sun was setting on an era, but inside, the shadows were lengthening to claim the only thing Seoa had left that truly belonged to her, the freedom to choose her own horizon. The air was perfectly still, holding its breath for the words that would eventually bind her heart to a throne she had never desired to sit upon. Her grandfather reached out, his hand feeling like weathered parchment against her own. His eyes, once sharp enough to command industries, were now softened by the veil of the coming night, but the iron in his will had not yet dissolved. He did not ask her about her dreams or the boy who waited for her in the rain. He spoke only of the Kim name, of the alliances that were the bedrock of their survival, and of the duty that was the price of her birthright. His voice was a thin thread of sound, yet it carried the weight of generations, an unyielding demand disguised as a final wish. "Protect our family," he whispered, the words settling into the room like heavy dust. "Through this marriage, Seo, let the Youngmin name be the wall that keeps our house standing." Seo did not cry. She did not pull her hand away. She stood there in the dim light, feeling the heavy, invisible links of the chain closing around her wrists. She thought of the schoolyard, of the laughter that was now a distant echo, and of the soft promises that were being overwritten by the cold ink of a contract. To say no was to let a dying man's hope shatter. To say yes was to walk into a beautiful cage and lock the door herself. She looked at the frail, proud man who had shaped her world, and she realized that love in the house of Kim was a luxury that had to be traded for the safety of the collective. She nodded once, a slow and graceful surrender. "I will do as you ask, grandfather." The promise was a silent oath that turned the room colder. In that moment she accepted the mantle of the successor, letting the ivory silk of her future become a shroud for the girl she used to be. She walked out of the room not as a daughter of youth, but as a sentinel of legacy, her heart beginning its long, quiet sleep beneath the reach of obligation. The world of the Youngmin was a vast, glittering machine that consumed the weak and rewarded only those with the courage to be hollow. To the outsiders who looked upon the family's high walls, the name was a symbol of unassailable power and ancient territory, but to the boy who walked its long, silent galleries, it was a forge designed to burn away the softness of youth. In the transition from the schoolyard to the inner sanctum of the empire, Samuel learned that a man's worth was not measured by the depth of his heart, but by the coldness of his resolve. The hallways where he had once imagined a different life were replaced by mahogany boardrooms and marble foyers where the air was always thin, and where every word spoken was a move on a board that stretched across the city. His mother was the high priestess of this transition, a woman whose expectations were made of unyielding iron and whose love was a reward for obedience. She did not see a son, she saw a successor, a vessel for a legacy that had survived through centuries of calculated silence and tactical sacrifice. She watched as he traded his well-worn books for leather-bound ledgers, and as the easy smile that had once belonged to Seoa was replaced by a neutral, unreadable mask. In the Youngmin Empire, emotions were not merely distractions. They were liabilities that could be exploited by enemies who were always watching for a fracture in the stone. Samuel moved through this new life with a steady, mechanical grace. He learned to look at a city and see only a map of influence, to look at people and see only assets or obstacles. The boy who had once found beauty in the cherry blossoms was being systematically dismantled, rebuilt piece by piece into a man who could command a room without raising his voice. He sat at the head of long tables where men 3 times his age waited for his nod, and he realized that the price of this power was a profound, echoing loneliness. He had become a sentinel of survival, a guardian of a name that required him to forget the sound of his own laughter. Yet even in the heart of that clinical darkness, the memory of Seoa remained like a small, stubborn flame. He saw her occasionally at the formal functions where their families performed the rituals of high society, her own face as still and beautiful as a statue's. They were 2 heirs playing their parts, moving in perfect synchronization with the music of their duty. He did not reach for her. He did not speak of the past. He simply accepted the weight of the crown he had been given, unaware that the world was already preparing to introduce him to a woman who would make the empire feel like a cage he could no longer inhabit. Antonia Sinclair was a sun that refused to be eclipsed by the gray, towering skyline of a world built on secrets. She entered a room not with the practiced, muted steps of a debutante, but with a vibrant cadence that made the very air seem to awaken and breathe. In a city where every glance was a transaction and every smile was a mask, she was an unapologetic brilliance, a former beauty queen from Atlanta who carried the warmth of the southern horizon in her laughter. Her presence was a beautiful defiance of the heavy mahogany and cold marble that had defined Samuel's existence, a radiant force that did not ask for permission to shine. To look at her was to remember that life was not merely a series of strategic maneuvers, but a vivid, unrestrained journey that could still be celebrated with a heart that had not yet been taught to be afraid. She was elegant in a way that felt effortless, her long dark hair cascading like silk over shoulders that never bowed to the weight of expectation. Her skin was light and luminous, as if she had captured the morning light and kept it beneath the surface, and her eyes held a bold, unrestrained curiosity that saw past the Jungmin title to the man who lived behind the iron resolve. With Antonia, the rigid architecture of Samuel's life began to soften. She did not know the history of the bloodlines or the alliances that held the city in a delicate, dangerous balance. She only knew the man who sat across from her and spoke of the books he used to read and the sky he used to watch. In the quiet hours spent in her company, Samuel felt the heavy mantle of the successor begin to slip. She was a woman who spoke of art and music with a passion that made the world feel wider, her voice a melody that drowned out the staccato rhythm of the boardroom. She called him by his name without the prefix of his rank, her laughter a clean, bright sound that shattered the silence of his carefully constructed universe. In her presence he was not a boss or a son bound by an ancient promise. He was simply a man standing in the light of a woman who saw him for who he truly was. He found himself seeking her out in the spaces between his duties, drawn to her like a traveler to a distant fire. The Jungmin Empire had spent years teaching him that emotions were liabilities, yet every moment with Antonia felt like a vital, necessary asset to his soul. She was the color in a world of black and white, the unrestrained joy in a house of calculated duty. He did not yet know how he would bridge the gap between his legacy and this new radiant truth, but as he watched her move through the world with her effortless grace, he realized that the safe, cold walls he had built were no longer enough to contain the man he was becoming. The revelation of a new life is a quiet storm that can wash away the foundations of even the strongest fortress. In the middle of a world defined by the cold arithmetic of legacy and the unyielding demands of an empire, the news of the child arrived like a soft, persistent dawn. It was a truth that did not care for boardrooms or bloodlines, a radiant secret that began to beat in a rhythm entirely separate from the ticking clocks of the Jungmin estate. Samuel stood in the center of a life he had meticulously constructed out of duty and silence, only to find that the air had suddenly become thick with a hope he was not prepared to carry. The weight of his name had always felt like a crown of iron, but this new reality was a mantle of gold, beautiful, heavy, and terrifyingly real. Antonia had told him on an afternoon when the light was particularly soft, her voice a warm melody that seemed to anchor him to the earth. She was 3 months along, carrying a future that was not part of the maps drawn by his mother or the alliances forged by Sioa's grandfather. In that moment, Samuel felt a profound, unrestrained joy that moved through him like a rising tide. He looked at Antonia, her radiant face, her silk-like hair, the effortless grace that had always been his sanctuary, and he saw not just the woman he loved, but the mother of a life that was entirely, honestly his. For a few heartbeats, the Jungmin Empire ceased to exist. There was only the steady breathing of the woman before him and the tiny, miraculous heartbeat of a secret heir. But joy in his world was rarely a solitary guest. It arrived tangled with a guilt that tasted like ash. Even as he held Antonia, the image of the upcoming wedding began to loom like a dark, immovable mountain on the horizon. He was a man divided, a soul caught between the radiant truth of the woman he cherished and the cold, ivory lie of the ceremony that was only weeks away. He had not told her about the marriage, not because he lacked the courage to speak, but because he could not bear to see the light in her eyes dim when she realized he was a man bound by chains he had not yet found the strength to break. He walked through the foyers of his home, the marble floors echoing with the sound of a man who was no longer sure of his footing. Every floral arrangement delivered for the wedding felt like a wreath for a life he was being forced to bury. Every congratulatory nod from his associates was a reminder of the deception he was maintaining. He was the protector of an empire, the successor to a throne, yet he felt like a thief in his own house, guarding a treasure he was not supposed to possess. The secret of the child was a beacon of light, but the shadow of the wedding was a growing darkness, and as the days narrowed toward the ceremony, Samuel Jungmin realized that he was standing at the edge of a choice that would either save him or finish the man he had spent his entire life becoming. The wedding gown was a masterpiece of lace and silk that felt like a beautifully woven trap. Within the sanctuary of her dressing room, Sioa stood before a mirror that reflected a woman she barely recognized, a vision of ivory perfection crafted to satisfy the hungers of two empires. The fabric was heavy, a dense weight against her skin that seemed to pull her toward the earth, while the long, intricate train trailed behind her like the remnants of a life she was no longer permitted to lead. Outside, the bells of the estate were beginning to toll, a majestic sound that filled the air with a sense of historic permanence. Yet inside the silence of the room she could feel the cold truth settling into the marrow of her bones. She was preparing to walk toward a man who was already miles away, a husband whose heart had been occupied by a different sun long before she stepped into the light of the aisle. Her bridesmaids moved around her with practiced muted grace, their hands adjusting the veil until it flowed over her shoulders like a waterfall of mist. They spoke in the hushed, melodic tones of a celebration, praising the way the diamonds at her throat caught the morning light, but Sioa heard their voices as if from the bottom of a deep well. She looked at her own hands, encased in delicate gloves, and saw that they were steady, not because she was brave, but because she had become a statue of obedience. She had been trained since the bedside of her grandfather to be a vessel for legacy, a sentinel of a name that required her to be a masterpiece of unbothered elegance even as the foundations of her world were dissolving. The realization was a quiet, unhurried storm. She knew, through the subtle language of high society and the hollow resonance of Samuel's recent letters, that he was merely a passenger in this ceremony. He was a man bound by the same iron chains of expectation, a soul who had found a radiant sanctuary elsewhere and was now being forced back into the cold mahogany halls of his duty. She did not feel the heat of a woman betrayed. She felt the profound, weary kinship of a fellow prisoner. They were two heirs about to exchange vows that were nothing more than signatures on a treaty, promising a lifetime of devotion to a cause that had already cost them their laughter. As the door opened to signal the start of the processional, Sioa inhaled the scent of the white roses that lined the hallway, a fragrance that was sweet and suffocating. She began to walk, her movements a study in mechanical grace, the ivory cage of her dress moving with her. Every step toward the altar was a step deeper into a life that was not hers, a journey toward a man who looked at her with eyes that were searching for a different horizon. She was a bride in the eyes of the city, a queen in the eyes of her family, but as she reached the edge of the garden, she knew she was merely a woman waiting for the truth to finally set the world on fire. The truth arrived not as a sudden storm, but as a heavy, unyielding dawn that stripped away the shadows of a long, expensive lie. In the center of a garden that had been meticulously designed to celebrate a union of two empires, the air was suddenly cleared of the suffocating scent of lilies and the hollow echoes of the evening's toasts. The moonlight fell in cold, silver sheets over the untouched white chairs, casting long shadows that seemed to point toward the inevitable. Samuel stood in the fading light of his wedding day, the tuxedo that had felt like a suit of armor now nothing more than a shroud for the man he was supposed to be. He looked at the woman who had just become his wife and realized that the most honorable move he could make was to finally let the world fall apart. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his eyes fixed on Sioa with a clarity that was beautiful and devastating. The garden was so still that the sound of the wind stirring the leaves seemed like a conversation between the ancient oaks. Samuel did not reach for her. He did not offer a gentle touch or a comforting word to soften the blow. He stood with a steady, unhurried posture, the weight of the Jungmin name finally sliding off his shoulders to leave him simply a man standing in the ruins of a legacy. "I can't lie to myself anymore," he said, his voice low and unwavering, carrying the resonance of a final judgment. "I love someone else. She is radiant. She is bold. She is a world I chose because it made me feel alive, not because it was a duty I was forced to carry." The words hung in the air, a profound confession that transformed the ivory silk of the wedding into a pale memory. Samuel spoke of Anthonia with a tenderness that Sioa had not heard in his voice since the schoolyard hallways of their youth. He told her of the 3 months of a life growing in secret, of a heart that had been occupied by a different sun long before the bells of the estate began to toll. He stood before her as a husband who was already gone, a man who was willing to set fire to the ivory cage they had built together if only to ensure that the light of his true life would not be extinguished. The confession was a clearing of the accounts, a moment where the ironclad expectations of their bloodlines were finally met by the unstoppable force of an honest heart. He looked at Sioa, waiting for the ruin he expected to see in her eyes, unaware that the truth he had just unleashed was not a weapon meant to destroy her. In the stillness of that garden, amidst the white roses and the cold marble, Samuel Jungmann had finally chosen a future of his own making, and in doing so he had unknowingly handed Seoa the very key she had been waiting for to unlock her own heart. The magnitude of a confession is often found not in the volume of the words, but in the profound silence that follows their arrival. In the heart of a garden that had seen the rise and fall of family fortunes, the air was suddenly stripped of its heavy ceremonial weight, leaving behind a clarity as sharp and beautiful as a midwinter dawn. Samuel stood amidst the white roses, his heart laid bare by the truth of a different life, waiting for the ruinous storm of a woman's heartbreak. He expected the shattering of ivory silk and the bitter cry of a soul betrayed, but instead he was met by a stillness so deep it seemed to anchor the very earth beneath their feet. The moonlight fell upon Seoa's face, revealing not a victim of his honesty, but a woman who had been standing on the edge of the same cliff, waiting for the courage to finally let go. She inhaled slowly, the scent of the evening air filling her lungs with a sweetness she had not felt in years. Her tears were steady, tracing slow, unhurried paths down her cheeks, yet they were not tears of sorrow. They were the quiet release of a long-held breath. She looked at Samuel, the husband of a few hours who was already a memory, and she realized that the iron chains of their legacy had finally met a force they could not contain. "I know," she whispered, her voice a steady melody that carried the resonance of a long-awaited homecoming. Samuel blinked, the sharp lines of his resolve beginning to soften into a profound, bewildered wonder. The garden grew so still that the distant hum of the city seemed to fade into a memory. He had spent months preparing for this battle, guarding his heart against the guilt of his choices, only to find that the woman across from him was not an opponent, but a companion in the same lonely journey. "I never fought for this marriage, Samuel," she continued softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon where a different sun was already preparing to rise. "Because my heart has been occupied by a different boy, a different life that I was forced to leave behind in the schoolyard. That love was real too. It was gentle. It was patient. It has been waiting for me somewhere beyond the reach of our names and our duties." The revelation was a second dawn, an unexpected grace that transformed the wreckage of their wedding into a sanctuary of mutual understanding. Seoa spoke of her own secret heart, of the quiet glances and shared notes that had sustained her through the cold halls of her grandfather's house. She stood in her ivory gown, no longer a bride of duty, but a woman who had finally found the words to match the rhythm of her own heart. For a long minute neither of them spoke. They were two heirs who had spent their lives bowing to legacy, two pieces on a board that had finally decided to move on their own. In the stillness of that garden, amidst the untouched champagne and the dying bubbles of a joy they never truly possessed, Seoa and Samuel Jungmann looked at each other with a beautiful, weary clarity, realizing that the truth had not destroyed them, it had simply saved them from a life they were never meant to live. The signing of a document is often viewed as a cold conclusion, but in the heart of the Jungmann library, it felt like the opening of a heavy, ancient door. Beneath the gaze of leather-bound histories and the steady, unhurried ticking of a grandfather clock, the air had lost its suffocating weight, replaced by a clarity so profound it seemed to illuminate the very dust motes dancing in the lamplight. There were no flashing cameras, no bitter shouts, and no scandalous whispers to mar the stillness of the hour. Only the soft scratching of a fountain pen against thick cream-colored paper echoed through the room, a rhythmic sound that did not signal the destruction of a union, but the restoration of two souls. Before the clock could strike the final note of midnight, the chains of an entire legacy had been dissolved by a few steady strokes of ink, turning what the world would call a catastrophe into a beautiful, quiet act of liberation. Samuel sat at the massive mahogany desk, his movements fluid and calm. He looked at the papers before him, the dissolution of a contract that had cost them both the color of their youth, and he felt a sense of peace that moved through him like a cool, clean tide. He signed his name not with the hesitation of a man losing an empire, but with the resolve of a man reclaiming his own skin. He pushed the folder toward Seoa, his gaze meeting hers with a deep, weary respect. They were no longer the Mafia boss and the Kim heiress, performing a ritual for their elders. They were simply two people who had finally found the grace to be honest in a house built on secrets. Seoa took the pen, her gloved fingers sure and steady. She did not look at the fine print or the divisions of assets that had been meticulously calculated by lawyers in high-rise offices. She looked only at the line where her name would join Samuel's in this final mutual departure. As the ink settled into the fibers of the page, she felt the ivory silk of her gown become light, as if the heavy train were no longer a burden of the past but a sail for a future she could finally choose. The scandal that their families had feared was nowhere to be found, replaced by an atmosphere of sophisticated, mature understanding that made the very concept of a marriage of duty seem like a distant, faded memory. When the last page was turned and the folder was closed, a profound stillness settled over the library. There were no tears of ruin. There was only the sound of two people exhaling the breath they had been holding since the day they left the schoolyard. They stood up together, moving with a liberated grace that the heavy suits and lace had always sought to contain. In the quiet of that midnight hour, as the moonlight spilled over the marble floors of the foyer, Samuel Young-min and Kim Seo walked away from the altar they had shared, not as victims of a shattered promise, but as the architects of a truth that had finally saved them both. The weight of a legacy is never heavier than at the moment it is defied. In the high-ceilinged boardroom of the Kim estate, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and the cooling ash of cigars, a place where the shadows seemed to hold the memories of every pact ever made in the dark. The elders sat in a semicircle of unyielding stone, their faces etched with the lines of a century of calculated moves and ironclad traditions. They did not see the two people before them as souls seeking light. They saw them as assets that had been willfully devalued. To walk into that room was to step into the heart of a machine that had been designed to crush any heartbeat that did not follow the rhythm of the family name. But as Seo stood before them, the ivory silk of her wedding dress discarded for a sharp, dark suit, she carried a stillness that was more powerful than any mountain. Her mother's eyes were narrow, two chips of flint that sought to spark a fire of shame, while the Young-min advisors stood with their arms folded, their silence a growing wall of disapproval. They spoke of the broken alliances, of the shame that would be whispered in the corridors of power, and of the strategic war that this union was supposed to have ended. They used words like betrayal and failure, as if they were brands meant to mark her skin, waiting for her to bow beneath the gravity of their collective will. "You were given a throne," her mother said, her voice a thin melodic edge. "And you have chosen to walk into the wilderness." Seo looked at the woman who had raised her to be a sentinel of duty, and she felt a profound, quiet clarity. She did not raise her voice. She did not seek to explain the schoolyard or the patient love that had been waiting for her in the shadows. She stood with a steady, unhurried grace that made the elders seem small in their vast, expensive chairs. "I was given a cage," Seo replied, her voice carrying the resonance of a final, beautiful truth. "And I am not walking into the wilderness. I am walking home. The papers are signed. The debt of my birthright has been paid in the years I spent being the daughter you demanded. From this hour, the Kim name is a history I respect, but it is no longer the map I follow." The room grew so still that the ticking of the clock seemed like the only heartbeat left. Samuel stood beside her, a silent witness to her strength, his own resolve a steady anchor in the storm. The elders looked at the two heirs they had tried to mold into monuments, and they saw instead two people who had found the courage to be human. Seo turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, her steps fluid and certain. She did not look back at the mahogany tables or the empty thrones. She walked out into the cool evening air, a woman who had finally traded the chains of a legacy for the simple, radiant freedom of her own heart. The warmth of the Atlanta sun was a profound and honest benediction, a golden light that did not hide the truth but celebrated it. Far from the gray, unyielding skylines and the cold marble corridors of the Young-min estate, the air here was thick with the scent of pine and the sweet, unhurried melody of a world that was permitted to bloom. In this new life, time was no longer measured by the ticking of ancient grandfather clocks or the closing of strategic windows of influence. It was measured by the lengthening shadows on a porch and the steady, rhythmic breathing of a woman who had become a man's entire horizon. Samuel stood in the center of a home that was built not of legacy but of choice, and he realized that the greatest power he had ever possessed was the simple, radiant ability to be exactly who he was. Anthonia moved through their home with a grace that seemed to draw the very light toward her, her silk-like hair catching the afternoon glow. She was a vision of vibrant life, a southern sun that had finally found its proper sky. The weight of the secret she had carried was gone, replaced by the beautiful, heavy reality of the child who was now only days away from entering the world. When Samuel looked at her, he did not see an alliance or a liability. He saw a sanctuary. He had traded an empire of stone for a kingdom of warmth, and as he watched the sunset over the Georgia hills, he knew that the bargain had been the only one in his life that truly mattered. The arrival of the child was a quiet miracle that shattered the last remnants of the man Samuel had been forced to be. In a room filled with the soft glow of a nightlight and the gentle humming of a lullaby, he held his son, a tiny, miraculous heir to nothing but a father's love and a mother's joy. The infant's heartbeat was a staccato rhythm of hope, a sound more majestic than any anthem or family decree. As Samuel looked down at the small, perfect face, he felt a sense of peace so deep it seemed to wash away the years of mahogany boardrooms and silent, duty-bound meals. This child was not a piece on a board. He was a testament to the freedom his parents had fought to claim. Life in Atlanta was a steady, beautiful flow of ordinary days that felt like extraordinary gifts. Samuel spent his afternoons not in the company of elders and advisors, but in the garden, feeling the earth between his fingers and the sun on his back. He had become a man who spoke of the future without the shadow of the past, a father who could look his son in the eye and know that the world ahead of him was wide and unrestrained. The Youngmin name remained a part of his history, but it was no longer his master. Under the Atlanta sun, amidst the laughter of the woman he cherished and the soft cries of the child they had created, Samuel Youngmin finally understood that the truth had not just saved him, it had given him a life he had never even dared to dream of. The pursuit of a lost dream is a journey through a landscape of shadows, where every turn requires the courage to believe that the heart's compass remains true even after years of silence. For Seo, the path back to the boy from the schoolyard was not a frantic race, but a steady, unhurried pilgrimage toward a memory that had refused to fade. In a world that had tried to bury her beneath the weight of mahogany boardrooms and ivory silk, this one connection had remained like a pilot light in a vast, dark house, small, stubborn, and radiating a warmth that the cold winds of legacy could not extinguish. She moved through the city with a liberated grace, no longer a piece on a board or a sentinel of duty, but a woman seeking the only soul who had ever looked at her and seen a person instead of a title. She found him in a quiet corner of the district where the buildings were low and the air was filled with the honest scent of old books and rain-drenched pavement. He was standing beneath the awning of a small gallery, his posture exactly as she remembered it, relaxed, observant, and holding a stillness that had always been her sanctuary. When he turned at the sound of her footsteps, there was no shock in his expression, only a beautiful, weary recognition that felt like the closing of a long, difficult circle. He had not spent the years building empires or forging alliances. He had spent them waiting, his heart a steady anchor in a sea of shifting expectations. "You came," he said, his voice a low melody that smoothed over the years of their separation. Seo stood before him, the sharp lines of her suit a stark contrast to the soft, nostalgic light of the evening. She did not offer a practiced apology or a tactical explanation. She simply looked at him with a clarity that was profound and absolute, letting the silence of the street carry the weight of everything they had sacrificed and everything they had finally reclaimed. The boy who had once brushed cherry blossoms from her hair had become a man whose eyes held a wisdom that did not ask for her to be anything other than herself. In his presence, the ivory cage of the Kim estate felt like a different world entirely. They walked together as the streetlights began to hum, their steps falling into a rhythm that was as natural as breathing. There were no contracts here, no dying wishes to fulfill, and no wars to settle with a signature. There was only the gentle, patient love that had survived the storm, a flame that had been kept alive by two people who had finally found the strength to walk out of the shadows. As they reached the edge of a park where the trees moved softly in the breeze, Seo realized that the wait had not been a tragedy. It had been the preparation for a life where love was no longer a burden but a home. The salvation of a soul is rarely found in a victory, but in the quiet, absolute courage to let a false world burn to the ground. In the final light of an evening that felt like the first true day of her life, Seo stood at the edge of a horizon that was no longer defined by the tall gates of the Kim estate or the ironclad demands of a Youngmin alliance. The air was sweet with the scent of rain and the distant, melodic hum of a city that was no longer her master. She looked back at the memory of the garden, at the ivory silk that had almost become her shroud, and she realized that the shame of her divorce was actually the most beautiful gift she had ever been given. She had not been ruined by the truth. She had been exhaled by it, released into a life where her heartbeat was the only rhythm she was required to follow. She stood beside the man who had waited for her through the years of her silence, his presence a steady, warm anchor in the cooling air. As he reached out to take her hand, his fingers were not a shackle but a welcome, a gentle connection that did not ask her to be a sentinel or a queen. In the unhurried stillness of their shared gaze, the magnitude of her escape finally settled into her soul. If she had stayed in that marriage, she would have become a monument to a name, a masterpiece of stoic elegance in a house where the windows were always closed. By choosing the end, she had chosen a beginning. By signing the papers at midnight, she had signed for the right to breathe. The world would continue to talk of the wedding that ended before sunrise, and the families would continue to count the cost of the broken pact. But Sioa knew that the only currency that mattered was the light in her own eyes. She thought of Samuel and Anthonia far away under the Atlanta sun, and she felt a profound, weary joy for the man who had had the courage to be honest. They were two survivors who had found their way through the storm, not by fighting the wind, but by letting go of the sails that were holding them back. As they walked together toward the flickering lights of a future they had designed themselves, Sioa felt the last of the chains fall away. The patient love that had sustained her in the shadows was now a radiant reality, a home that did not require her to sacrifice her laughter. She was no longer a piece on a board or a daughter of legacy. She was a woman who had been saved by the very thing she had been taught to fear. Some marriages are meant to build a house, but theirs had been meant to build a door. And as she stepped through it, Kim Sioa realized that the truth had not only ended her marriage, it had at long last given her back her life.